who do not know me, my name is Peter Kavoyan, and I am so no, that's right. I've stacked the deck here. I'm so pleased to be up here on behalf of the Birnam Wood Homeowners Committee. And I would like to welcome all of you to the third installment of our speaker series for 2021. Again, it is another sold-out event. Actually, it's sold out in 1 hour after we announced it. Tonight, we could not be more pleased to have with us Dr. Stephen Gundry. Now, some of you may be familiar with Dr. Gundry and his work, and maybe some of you not so much. So before we go any further, let me just ask a few questions to sort of test the water. If you can answer yes to any of the following questions, just raise your hand. Okay, everyone got that? All right, so we have a few questions. First is, raise your hand if you are a patient of Dr. Gundry's. Oh, wow. That's right, and they're disclosing. Actually, it's quite a few people here. Raise your hand if you have listened to one or more of his 173 podcasts. Whoa, wow, that's a marketing 101. Raise your hand if you have read one or more of his numerous best-selling books. Wow, they're the readers, okay. Raise your hand if you have watched one or more of his videos or have used one or more of his products. Okay, wow, okay. How about have you seen him on YouTube? Right, you can't go on YouTube without seeing Dr. Gundry. He is absolutely everywhere. Very, very impressive. It certainly appears that we have a very informed audience tonight. But I'd like to ask just one more question. Raise your hand if you don't know who the heck Dr. Gundry is, and you're only here tonight for the gourmet dinner. Sir, thank you. I will promise you'll like the meal. It's a delicious dinner. Okay. So now let me share a little bit about Dr. Gundry that you may or may not know. Very briefly, he's a cardiologist, a heart surgeon, a medical researcher, and an author. His medical career spans over 40 years. He's performed countless pediatric heart transplants. He has been long known as one of the world's preeminent experts in heart surgery, and in fact, hopeless cases were his specialty. He also developed and patented life-saving medical equipment that is still used today and drastically improves the way doctors save lives. He has published over 300 articles on his research. In 2002, he left his position at Loma Linda University Medical Center as professor and chairman of cardiothoracic surgery. He decided instead to teach patients how to live healthier lives through diet and lifestyle choices. His vision has been to help patients avoid the very diseases and surgeries he has performed over 3 decades. Like Hippocrates, Dr. Gundry believes that 95% of all disease begins and ends in the gut. Today, he still sees patients 6 or 7 days a week at his centers for restorative medicine in both Palm Springs and Montecito. To expand his international reach and help more people, he's published 7 books Most have been recognized on the New York Times bestsellers list and are published in more than 30 languages. As if this is not enough, he has also developed a product line that has grown to include over 60 foods, skincare, and supplemental products. He has 2.5 million social media followers. He is, in fact, the Kim Kardashian of medicine. I mean, and this is the short version of his remarkable and numerous accomplishments. But you know, Dr. G, you are not the only one who has accomplished some lofty goals. I don't want to brag, but in high school, I conducted a very successful turkey raffle. Yeah. In fact, we raffled so many turkeys that our band was able to go on an all-expenses-paid trip to Bakersfield. It's true. They're still talking about it. Okay, so accompanying Dr. Gundry tonight is his longtime friend and award-winning chef, Jimmy Schmidt. While Dr. G will more formally introduce Chef Jimmy a little later, please note that Jimmy has graciously traveled from Detroit with his adorable wife, Jo, there's Jo, and to prepare this magnificent and very healthy dinner for all of us lucky people tonight. So now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Gundry.
Wow. Thank you, Peter. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I know a great number of you, and thank you for coming. And those of you who I don't know, I hope to know you soon. There's a rumor that we may have gotten accepted for membership here at your august club, and thank you very much. Apparently, this is my final edition, and if I fail, I guess, yeah. The check hasn't been cashed yet, so what the heck. So I don't deserve that nice introduction, but I'm always reminded of Mark Twain when he was introduced with such a flowing remark. He said, you know, I don't deserve that introduction either, but I have arthritis and I don't deserve that either, so I'll take it. Incidentally, I used to have arthritis and I don't have it anymore. And maybe I'll tempt you with that first of all. Those of you who don't know me, you kind of heard about that. Hopefully you've seen me somehow on my two PBS specials, The Longevity Paradox, and the most recent one, The Energy Paradox, which is my new best-selling book. I write about a book a year, sometimes more than that, unfortunately. And my research spans a very long time. We were talking before the dinner. Again, for those of you who don't know me, I went to Yale as an undergraduate back in the dark ages, like many of the audience here. And back in those dark ages, we were allowed at Yale to have a special major. We could design our own major. And we would actually set up simply a research project for 4 years and a thesis that we would have to defend, very much like getting a master's degree. And so my thesis was, you could take a great ape, manipulate its food supply, and manipulate its environment, and you would prove that you would arrive at a human being. So I spent 4 years researching this, and I actually defended my thesis, and I got an honors, and I gave it to my parents, and went off to become arguably a very world-famous heart surgeon. And those of you who've heard of infant and pediatric heart transplantation, my partner and I, Leonard Bailey, pioneered that field. I've done more pediatric heart transplants than anybody in the world. I became famous for operating on people who nobody else wanted to operate on. And I patented many devices that are still used in the vast majority of heart surgery to protect the heart during heart surgery. And I developed minimally invasive heart surgery. I was the first person to show that you could change 3 valves in somebody's heart through a 2-inch incision. And now that's standard of care. It carries my name. But almost 25 years ago now, I think it's 23, I was at my office at Loma Linda University where I was professor and chairman. And I was sent a gentleman by the name of Big Ed. So anybody who's read the book, anybody heard of Big Ed in the book? Okay, anybody who's watched the videos, you've heard of Big Ed. So Big Ed was a big fat guy, 48 years old, from Miami, Florida. And Big Ed had developed inoperable coronary artery disease. All of his blood vessels were clogged up. You couldn't put stents in them. You couldn't do bypasses because there wasn't any place to jump to. Everything was clogged up. And Big Ed would take his angiogram, the movie of his heart. He went around the country. And there's a few idiots like myself who would say, oh, heck, everybody turns you down, come on over here. So, he went to Stanford, he went to Columbia, he went to Mayo, and I could go on and on. He went to Texas Heart, and everybody turned him down, rightfully so. So you're gonna think, well, Dr. Gundry operated on, of course. No. He arrived in my office about 6 months into this journey, and I looked at his movie, the angiogram of his heart. Anybody had a cardiac catheterization? Anybody? You don't have to volunteer. Okay. So, it shows where all these blockages are. And I looked at it from 6 months ago in Miami, and I said, Big Ed, I don't want to break your bubble, but I got to turn you down. I'm not going to help you. And he says, well, that's what everybody else has told me. But here's the deal. He says, I've gone on a diet the last 6 months, and I've lost 45 pounds. Now, the reason he's called Big Ed is because when I met him, he was 265 pounds. Big Ed. But he had lost 45 pounds. And he said, the other thing I did is I went to a health food store and I bought a bunch of supplements. And he actually brought in a very large shopping bag. I think it was a Nordstrom bag as I think about it. Anyhow, and it's full to the brim with supplements. And he says, and I've been taking these for the last 6 months. And, I'm scratching my professor beard. And I said, good for you, Big Ed, but, that's not going to do anything in here. And he said, well, look, I've come all the way from Miami. What would it hurt to get another angiogram? And I'm going, well, don't get your hopes up. So we get another angiogram. And in 6 months' time, Big Ed has cleaned out 50% of the blockages in his heart. 50%. They're gone. I'm looking at the 2 angiograms back to back. And I'm going, what the heck? How'd you do that? And I said, tell me about this diet. And he starts talking about what he eat. And, about, 2 sentences in, I said, wait a minute, time out. I said, this is the thesis I wrote, in the dark ages at Yale about what ancient humans ate that turned them into humans. And I said, let me look in that bag of supplements. And so I'm famous for keeping hearts alive during heart surgery and for heart transplant by putting magic potions down the arteries and veins of the hearts to protect them. And I started looking up these supplements, and a lot of these supplements are the magic potions that I was putting down the veins and arteries of these hearts. And it never occurred to me to swallow the dumb things. So I called my parents, who at that time lived in San Diego, and I said, do you still, have my thesis? And they said, oh yeah, it's here in the shrine. We'll move the eternal flame and pull it down. I'm sure you all have one for your kids, I hope. Maybe your parents had one for you. And I said, well, send it up to me. Now, why is that so interesting? Why is that so poignant? Well, at that time, despite being a very famous heart surgeon, I was obese. I had arthritis. I ran 30 miles a week, did 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons on the weekend. I went to the gym 1 hour every day. I had high cholesterol, I had prediabetes, I operated with migraine headaches. I do not recommend doing an infant heart transplant with a migraine headache, but somebody's got to do it, and I did. So I had all these things, and my colleagues would say, well, your dad had all these things, and this is genetic, and, you know, have a nice day. So I called my folks, said, you got my thesis? And I put myself on my thesis, and I lost 50 pounds my first year. I started taking Big Ed supplements, and I started sending my blood work up to Berkeley, California, where the major lab in lipidology was. And my horrible low good cholesterol, all of a sudden, which was, I was told was genetic, all of a sudden rose from 32, which is really bad, folks, to 80, which is really good. And my really bad cholesterol dropped over 100 points. And my arthritis went away. My migraine headaches went away. My prediabetes went away. And I started putting my patients at Loma Linda, who I operated on for heart disease, on my program. And no sooner did I do that, that patients would call a few weeks later and say, wow, you know, my blood pressure is really low. What supplement are you giving that's making my blood pressure really low? And I'd look at my nurse, I'd say, you know, there's nothing in here that's going to make low blood pressure. You know, come on into the clinic. And sure enough, their blood pressure was low. Now, these were people on like 3 blood pressure medicines. And we go, oh, that's interesting. You know, stop that blood pressure medicine. We'll see you next week. And they'll come back next week. Their blood pressure a little better, but still low. Stop that one. And so this happened over and over again. Diabetics would call and say, gee, my blood sugar's really low. Well, cut your insulin in half. And a couple weeks would go by, wow, my blood sugar's really low. Well, stop your insulin. And this went on for a year. And on a fateful day, it was a Friday, Penny, my lovely wife, still remembers it as Black Friday and not a shopping day. I was looking in the mirror before going to work, and I said, you know, I've made a horrible mistake. I shouldn't operate on people and then teach them how to eat to avoid me later. I should teach them how to eat so that they will never need my services. Now, that is a horrible career choice, I assure you, for a heart surgeon. And many of my colleagues said, you're trying to put yourself out of business. And I said, yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. So at the height of my career, I resigned my position and set up a clinic in Palm Springs, which is near Loma Linda, and asked patients basically to be my research project. And every 3 months, I wanted to ask them to take certain foods away, to put certain foods in their diet. I sent them to Costco and Trader Joe's or the health food store to get some supplements. And every 3 months, we'd draw blood work on them that insurance would pay for, that Medicare would pay for. And we started tracking what would happen to them. And lo and behold, that became my first book back in 2007, which was Dr. Gundry's Diet Evolution. And then a lot of people who read that book, there were a few people who had autoimmune diseases in that book. And they would show up in my clinic and say, what do you know about autoimmune disease? And I was honest, and I said, I have absolutely no knowledge about autoimmune disease, but I'm a transplant immunologist. I know how to fool the immune system. I'm famous for putting a pig heart in a baboon and having that heart function perfectly normally for 30 days. The previous record was 4 hours. So I know how to fool the immune system. So I said, hey, if you want to play, let's play. I'll learn with you. And so subsequent to that, now about 80% of my practice is autoimmune disease. And I became fascinated by the gut and what the ding-dong the gut has to do with heart surgery, it turns out it has everything to do with heart surgery. I'll give you a nice anecdote from the weekend. Anybody heard of David Perlmutter, Grain Brain? Very, very famous, prolific neurologist from Naples, Florida. He and I have become good friends. Dale Bredesen, the end of Alzheimer's. Dale and I have become good friends. And Dr. Perlmutter, we send each other papers all the time. And last weekend, there was another paper that everybody's heard of amyloid and dementia and Alzheimer's disease, this stuff in your brain. Well, it turns out that amyloid doesn't come from the brain. It comes from the gut, and it travels to the brain. And I had just sent Dr. Perlmutter a new paper that I thought he'd be interested in. And he texts me back, and he says, well, you know, one of these markers for Parkinson also comes from the gut. And I said, yeah, I know that. I said, but, you know, thanks for sharing. And I said, you know, isn't it funny that, you know, you're interested in the brain, and I'm interested in the heart, and all of us have actually arrived where none of us were particularly interested in going, and that's the gut. And it turns out that Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago, the father of medicine, said all disease begins in the gut. Now, one of my colleagues, Alessio Fasano, who's now at Harvard, rephrased that and wrote a paper last year, all disease begins in a leaky gut. Now, he stole that title from me because I gave a paper in Paris 2 years ago that he was attending, but that's okay. He's right. All disease begins in a leaky gut. Now, I've paraphrased Hippocrates, that all disease indeed begins in a leaky gut, and all disease ends in a sealed gut. And that's kind of the topic of the conversation tonight. A long-winded way to get there. So those of you who watched The Longevity Paradox or read the book, The Longevity Paradox, one of the fascinating things we now know about our fate that Hippocrates knew 2,500 years ago, before all of our fancy tests, was that our fate is actually in the hands of about 100 trillion bacteria and fungi and parasites and one-celled organisms that live in our gut, our microbiome. Now, we didn't even know these guys existed until about 10 years ago, when the Human Microbiome Project was completed. And what we learned, and what we've learned almost every day subsequently, is that most everything that we thought was potentially a natural part of aging, or was genetics, that our genes determined our fate, actually was completely wrong. In fact, a paper published in Nature, a prestigious journal, in 2018, showed that your fate, 92% of the things that are going to happen to you occur from what's happening in your gut. And only 8% of your fate is determined by your genes. So when I take a family history now, what I'm doing is I want to know what your parents ate and what your parents fed you, and then I'll know what's going to happen to you if your parents developed heart disease. It was because of what they ate. If your parents developed diabetes, it was because of what they ate. If your parents developed Alzheimer's, it was because of what they ate. And you learned from your parents how to eat. Now, there's been some fantastic recent twin studies that look at twins who are genetically identical, who are separated at birth, adopted, put into foster homes. But one of my friends, Tim Nestor from England, has been following the twin study. And it turns out that the fate of those twins have absolutely nothing to do with their genetic identity. It has to do with who raised them and the exposure that they were exposed to by the microbiome of the families that they lived with. Here's another fascinating thing. We exchange microbiome all the time, and it turns out that families share a very common microbiome. Interestingly enough, obese people have a very different microbiome than skinny people. And in fact, we can take skinny rats and feed them the feces from obese people. Rats love feces. I got news for you. They just chow down. Anybody got a dog that likes to eat poop? Yeah, we have one. I know, I'm divulging too much. So rats love to eat poop. So you feed these skinny rats fat human poop, and the skinny rats become fat. Now, you can take fat rats, you know where I'm going, and you feed them skinny people's poop, and they become skinny. There's a very famous woman that was published in Lancet a few years ago. This was a marathon runner. She developed C. difficile infection, a very horrible infection in your colon. Some of you may have had it. Currently, we treat it primarily now with a fecal transplant. We give them a crap enema, as we say. We take feces from healthy people and we shove it up their ass. We do. Now, why I think that's so interesting, believe it or not, when I was a medical student at the Medical College of Georgia, the fourth oldest medical school in the country, back in the dark ages in the 1970s, my professor, Arlie Mansberger, believed that you could cure C. difficile, we didn't know what it was back then, by giving patients fecal enemas. This is in the 1970s. And once a week, a honey bucket was passed around to the medical students. And we would take a crap in the honey bucket. And he would take it back to his lab, I'm serious, and put it in a Waring blender. The visual is just too good. And homogenize it and put it in an enema bag. And we would give it to these patients. And lo and behold, these patients were cured. Now, everybody thought he was really crazy. But the before and after pictures were startling. So way back in the 1970s, we knew this. We didn't know why it worked. But he was convinced that it was a problem that the microbiome had been changed, and if we just give somebody the good microbiome, it'll be fine. So anyhow, so this lady gets C. difficile, and they look for a related donor, because like I said, families kind of share the microbiome. And she had a cousin who happened to be overweight. But she was a really good match. So the husband gave her her crap, and she recovered. And then in the next year, despite going back to marathon running, this woman gained 30 pounds without changing anything that she ate, without changing her exercise program. Just the new bacteria had actually become incredibly efficient at extracting calories out of the food she eat and passing it into her. Now, you're all thinking about your skinny friends who can eat anything they want and never gain an ounce. Yeah, I'm looking at you. And you go, well, what the heck? Must be good genes. Well, now from the twin study, we know that in fact it's not good genes. That an obese twin, number one, has a totally different microbiome than the skinny twin. But in people who are not genetically related, it turns out that skinny people, They're mitochondria. Anybody heard of mitochondria? The little energy organelles, the powerhouses of the cells, the power plants of the cells. That's the new book, The Energy Paradox. It turns out that the mitochondria in skinny people know actually how to waste calories. They actually don't use them. They actually, literally, those mitochondria are Ferraris, and most of our mitochondria are Toyota Priuses. And so if you want to waste a lot of gasoline, you want a Ferrari. Now, there might be other reasons to have a Ferrari, but wasting gasoline is a very good reason. So it turns out that skinny people's mitochondria have been told by their gut microbiome to waste calories. And we now know that we can manipulate your and my microbiome to tell our mitochondria, if we so desire, to waste calories. Why is that so important? Why you're here. Turns out, if you look at super old people, folks in their late 90s, early 100s who are thriving, they're climbing hills in Italy, herding sheep, they go faster than I can chase them. These guys, when we look at their mitochondria, every one of them, and this has been done, their mitochondria are Ferraris, and they waste calories. Now that sounds really dumb, but it turns out the more you can train mitochondria to actually waste calories, the less damage they do to themselves. And I'd have to give you another 4-hour lecture on why that happens. But the point of all this is, and here's the best part, the mitochondria that live in all of our cells, and there's thousands of them in each of our cells, not like the textbooks we saw in high school where there's a couple mitochondria, they're packed in there. These mitochondria are actually ancient bacteria that 2 billion years ago, a cell came along and ate a bacteria. And instead of digesting the bacteria said, hey, wait a minute, before you eat me, kind of like Jonah swallows the whale, I got a deal for you. If you'll let me live and stay here inside of you and give me a little something to eat, I'll make energy for you. Fair enough? Apparently, it was a really good deal because almost all eukaryotic cells, all of us, have mitochondria, which are actually those ancient bacteria. And what's really exciting, and that was the topic of the energy paradox, is our microbiome is actually sisters to our mitochondria. They are sisterhood. And like good sisters, I have 2 daughters, they talk to each other sometimes. And it turns out that the microbiome talks to the mitochondria. And they tell the mitochondria what to do. If they tell the mitochondria, hey, waste some energy, knock your socks off, the mitochondria do that. If they tell the mitochondria, hey, let's put on some fat, get lazy, they do that. And it's kind of like, there's all this, talking going on. And people go, well, wait a minute, come on, they're not talking to each other. Well, in fact, a few years ago, the Nobel Prize for Medicine was awarded for the discovery of the language that our bacteria in our gut use to talk to their sisters in all of our cells. And they got the Nobel Prize for Medicine. And there is a language, and most of us are old enough to remember the not Omega, now I can't even remember what it was, the code that the Germans used in World War II. Not Morse, the Enigma code, thank you. So the breaking of the Enigma code, the breaking of that coded language, this achievement literally said, holy cow, there is a language that these little one-celled organisms talk to their sisters in all of our cells, and they control what's going to happen to us. Now, most of us smart people really do not like to hear that because, oh, come on now, little single-cell organisms are going to do that? Yes. And it turns out what those organisms are and how they relate to our gut and our mitochondria determines our fate. Now, before we get depressed, the exciting thing is we now know that language. We now know how to manipulate that language. And one of my most recent research projects is there's another way to influence mitochondria. And that is something I learned from Big Ed. He didn't know, I didn't know. And it's really the foundation of Gundry MD, and that's in polyphenols. Anybody heard of polyphenols? Anyone who's having red wine, you're drinking polyphenols right now. And so polyphenols are these compounds that actually tell mitochondria to become Ferraris. So believe it or not, every time you have a glass of red wine, you're telling your mitochondria to become Ferraris. So I don't have a Ferrari, but at least I can have a Ferrari mitochondria. And that's encouraging. So the long and short of this is, and I think I'll probably conclude, maybe you want some questions. We have control of our fate. We have control of our health span. Health span means the number of years that we live healthfully. Lifespan, of course, is the number of years we live. And the longevity paradox is we all want to live a long time, but we don't want to get old. And in fact, living a long time does not mean that you have to get old. I just have a new third-year family medicine resident in my office this week, last year before they go into practice. And we're looking at all these labs. She said, well, this lab always gets bad when you get old, and this lab always gets worse when you get old, and this gets worse when you get old. I said, no, that's actually not true. And her mouth says, well, of course it's true. Things change when you get old. And then I'd show her a lab from a 105-year-old patient, and they're perfectly normal. And she said, but that's impossible because we know that this is what happens when you get old. And I said, apparently someone didn't tell her this. So what we as physicians have been taught, and what she's coming to realize, is that most of what we were taught about our fate is completely wrong, completely backwards. And if we take care of this 5-pound organ that lives within us, the microbiome, and if we give as much attention to the care and feeding of that organism that we do to our dog, or maybe our house, remember, this is the only house that they're ever going to live in. This, as far as we know, I'm willing to learn, this is the only house we're ever going to have. You don't get a new one. The really cool thing is the microbiome wants their house to be around. And if you give them the tools, they will take your fixer-upper and turn it into a palace. I'm a living example of that. Most of my patients are living examples of that. I have 85-year-old women who are on their death's door with diabetes and heart disease and hypertension and arthritis. And at 95, they're dyeing their hair bright red and dancing and are very tired of 80-year-olds and are chasing 70-year-olds. I kid you not, and it's really cute, but you actually change 90% of all your cells every 3 months. You throw the old ones out, you build a new one. if you give them good building materials, if you get direction from your microbiome, then most of us in longevity research think that 120 is just the beginning. A friend of mine, Dave Asprey, is planning to live to 180. He's a little younger than me. I'm going for 150. And is it possible? Yes, it absolutely is. What we now know about aging flips everything on its head. Now, that leads me into Chef Jimmy Schmidt. Now, most of you thought that you were going to come here and eat twigs and bark and didn't you? Didn't you? Huh? I heard the conversation. Yeah, oh my gosh, we have to eat this crap. So Jimmy Schmidt is a 3 times James Beard Award-winning chef, and I hope you know what that means. And Jimmy and I got to know each other, about 20 years ago now. And Jimmy has had some world-class restaurants in Detroit, in Palm Springs, in Denver. And Jimmy and I met at a fundraiser for the American Heart Association where I was president. And we kind of hit it off. Jimmy Schmidt actually invented the Atkins bar. Still makes them. Wow. So Jimmy and I have had a long-term collaboration. Jimmy has made a bar for Gundry MD. But Jimmy actually bought into this idea that you want to eat food you love, but food that loves you back. And unfortunately, most of us eat food we love that doesn't return the favor. In fact, it's a very bad relationship. So what Jimmy is, he is an incredible alchemist. And what you're going to be treated to tonight is you're going to have food you love, I promise you. But it's going to taste like food you love. It's going to look like food you love. But it has ingredients that actually your gut microbiome loves as much as your taste buds. And you watch. If somebody leaves here not happy, I'll eat your portion. He actually pioneered the idea when he had restaurants of fooling his customers. And I'll never forget one time in Palm Springs, he used to do a fettuccine dish. That's really good. And people would go, oh, I need the recipe, what fettuccine is that? And he'd say, it's hearts of palm that I've sliced really thin. And everybody goes, wow, what? And they thought it was pasta. And it tasted like pasta. In fact, it tasted like the best pasta they ever had in their life. So Jimmy's going to wow you. I'm setting him up. You'll be really delighted. And probably with each course, he's going to tell you what he's doing. And I'll give you a little idea of why he's doing what he's doing and the tricks he's using to get polyphenols into you, to get food that your gut buddies like. And so this food is actually going to save your life even while you are savoring it. And that's really exciting. And I'm so excited he agreed to come here. He doesn't have to do this. But we go back a long way. And I really want you, my new club members, to really appreciate how great food can be that can save your life. Okay? All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That was a very interesting talk. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on the Viome. Obviously, we're in this virus era at the moment. Perhaps this is the origins of life rather than the mitochondria, but obviously discovering more about the Viome in the gut as well.
Okay, so we usually talk about the microbiome, and microbiome traditionally is what lives in our gut. There's a better term that I think called the holobiome, and the holobiome is all the various species, including viruses, that live on us, in our mouth, in our nose. Believe it or not, each one of us have a holobiome cloud around us of these viruses, these bacteria. And fascinatingly, I know it sounds very science fiction, but there is a good theory that this personal distance that we like to keep from somebody is actually our holobiome running up against the other person's holobiome. Now it gets even more interesting. Kissing, deep kissing, is a universal human habit. It's also quite common in primates. It turns out that there's some very interesting conjecture that the reason we all do this is for your holobiome to talk to this person you're kissing holobiome and see if they're compatible. And if we carry this one step further, if they're compatible, then go for it. And if they're not compatible, you're going to go, nah, not for me. Now, as strange as that may seem, how many of you have heard of Dr. Daniel Amen from the Amen Clinics? So he's primarily, he's based in Santa Monica, but he has clinics now around the world. He's a psychiatrist who now says, and I agree with him, that we should never think of mental illness the way we used to think of mental illness, and we should think of mental illness as a gut dysbiosis problem, and that the gut controls our emotions, controls anger, it controls all sorts of crazy things. And I can bore you with that the rest of the night, but he's now convinced, a psychiatrist, that we've done this all wrong. And so here's a neurologist, a heart surgeon, a cardiologist, and a psychiatrist. Now all we're interested in is the gut. And quite frankly, none of us ever thought we'd go down there. So you're right about the biome. Interestingly enough, fun fact, Eli Lilly from Indianapolis, one of our first drug companies, was founded making bacteriophages, which are viruses that infect bacteria. And they actually can kill bacteria, they can manipulate bacteria, they can change the genes of bacteria. So Eli Lilly, back before really drugs, made a business out of selling bacteriophages that you would swallow to change your microbiome. And lo and behold, it's actually coming around. We now know that the viruses are going to have a big effect. Fun fact, viruses are really good at causing leaky gut. And many of my patients with autoimmune diseases, and in those of you who are not aware, autoimmune disease is an epidemic, unheard of, unseen before. And one thing that can cause leaky gut is a viral infection in your gut. And oh, by the way, many of us believe that long COVID actually is set up by COVID breaking down your gut wall as part of its infection and causing leaky gut. And there's actually some pretty interesting evidence to that effect. So you're right, the biome, in a way, we're back to the future. The bacteriophages was really the start of all this, and we're going to go back and revisit the biome. Yeah, so great question. Very knowledgeable. Yes, sir. Oops. John, I can hear you.
For those who are wishing to tune up their gut, is there a supplement, perhaps a holy grail that they could think about, you could tell us about?
So, there was a particular bug. For those of you who have read The Longevity Paradox, there's a bug called Akkermansia muscipula. I'm terrible with names, but Penny goes, well, how? And eosinophil. This says mucus-loving bug. And this little bug lives in the mucus layer of our gut. And I won't bore you, but the more mucus you have in your gut, the longer you live, and the longer you live well. So Akkermansia is odd because it eats mucus. And interestingly enough, the more mucus it eats, the more the wall of your gut produces mucus. So it's actually a win-win. It stimulates the wall of your gut to make mucus. It eats mucus. The thicker your mucus goes. And as long as that mucus layer is thick, you're in great shape. Now, so everybody, when this was discovered about 12 years ago, everybody says, oh my gosh, I got to get me some Akkermansia. Not so fast. You can't grow Akkermansia in a test tube, in broth. The federal government won't. Akkermansia likes to eat animal mucus, snot. You can't grow bacteria that you're going to have somebody swallow in animal snot because of mad cow disease. And so the FDA will not allow you to have a probiotic grown in animal product. The only problem is Akkermansia has to have animal mucus to grow. So a researcher in the Bay Area 10 years ago, prompted by an illness in one of her daughters with leaky gut, said, doggone it, I'm going to figure out how to do this. So this young woman, I've had her on my podcast, and those of you who listen to my podcast, listen to it, it's really good. They're all good, but this one's really good. So Colleen said, I'm going to figure out how to make this thing eat plant-based mucus. And she figured it out. Only one problem. Akkermansia is what's called an obligate anaerobe. It has to live without oxygen. If it's exposed to air, it dies. She said, shoot. So she says, okay, we're going to build a big lab, and we're all going to wear spacesuits, and everything in there is going to be nitrogen and hydrogen and carbon dioxide, and there won't be any oxygen. And there'll be double doors. It'll be hermetically sealed. And lo and behold, they did it. And then they said, well, shoot, if we put it in a capsule, it'll be exposed to air, and it'll go down the line. And so they had to basically figure out a way to make a capsule airtight. And this took 10 years. And just a few months ago, they released the product. And the company's name, and I have no relationship with them. I'm not an investor. I'm a fan. It's called Pendulum, pendulumlife.com. They just released a second product. The first product has a bunch of cool ingredients. The second product, just released a couple weeks ago, is just plain old Akkermansia, and the name on the bottle says Akkermansia. And the cool thing about that is that you don't have to put it in a refrigerator. So it is the holy grail of microbiome research. And the reason I say that is, in longevity studies, the more Akkermansia that you have, the longer you live and the longer you live well, no matter what. So please don't exhaust the supply, because I really want some. I made the mistake years ago of telling people that they have to eat greater than 72% dark chocolate. And I said Trader Joe's makes a really good one from Belgium. Little did I know that there wasn't any Trader Joe's Belgian chocolate, 72%, for months after I said that, because it was wiped out. I shouldn't be on the internet so much. Anyhow, so that's really, solving this, I think, is one of those really cool milestones. And again, I've got to somehow convince you that what happens in here, what we feed our bugs, what kind of bugs we have, will control your fate. Actually, I'll give you one more teaser, and then I'll shut up. Robert Sapolsky, who I dedicated my first book to, is a researcher at Stanford, and he's a fascinating guy. I actually wanted to go spend a year of research in Africa with him. He studies baboons, etc. And he's an expert on toxoplasmosis. Anybody heard of toxoplasmosis? Anybody got a cat? Anybody? Nobody's got a cat? Ray, you had a cat. Peter. So, you don't want to talk about that cat. So cats, any pregnant woman is told to avoid cats because cats can be infected with toxoplasmosis. And toxoplasmosis actually wants to get into a cat brain. And toxoplasmosis has this really cool life cycle, and it's a long story short, but its intermediate host is a rat. And it has to get into a rat, and then the rat has to be eaten by a cat, and then it gets into the cat's brain where it really wants to live. So what does it do? The rat gets infected with toxoplasmosis by drinking toxoplasmosis in water that cats crap in. The toxoplasmosis goes to the rat's brain and rewires the brain of the rat, this one cell organism, and tells the rat that it's desperately in love with a cat. And that if it smells a cat or if it smells cat urine, rather than run, it makes a beeline for the cat. And the cat, of course, eats it. Toxoplasmosis takes over the brain of the cat. Now, why is that so cool? Is the US government, Bill, actually studied infecting United States soldiers with toxoplasmosis so that they would run to danger rather than away. And he has a 1-hour lecture on it that will startle you. And it turns out that if you look at motorcycle accidents, the vast majority of high-speed motorcycle accidents, their brains are infected with toxoplasmosis. It turns out that a large number of schizophrenics have brains that are infected with toxoplasmosis. So the reason I bring him up, and he's really one of the first persons who actually convinced me that I was looking in the wrong area. If a one-cell organism can do that to a cat or a human being, one-cell organism, imagine what 100 trillion organisms are doing to you right now, the messages they are sending you, and the effect they're going to have on every day the rest of your life and how that life will be lived. It's actually incredibly empowering as long as you now know what to feed them. And so that's where we're going dinner.